Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today we have a very special recording. We have two guests. We have Dr. Gustav Gressel, who is a fellow at the European Resilience Initiative Center, ERIC, and also senior fellow at the European Center of Foreign Policy, CFR. And because you wrote us so often your wish to see another guest who is also a famous military expert and a very good expert in what is going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war, you wrote us, why don't you have Dr. Markus Reisner? We said, why don't have both? And now we have the second guest, Colonel Dr. Markus Reisner, who is a colonel of the Austrian Army and the head of the Institute of Officers Basic Training at the Austrian Military Academy. Welcome, Dr. Gressel, and welcome, Dr. Reisner.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having joined us today. And my first question goes on Colonel Reisner. We are now in the third year of the full-scale invasion, the Russo-Ukrainian war. What the Russians believed will end in 72 hours, what some in the West believed will end in several weeks with the Ukrainian defeat. Then the same experts believed it will end very fast in decisive Ukrainian victory over the Russians. And now it is the third year and it looks like it will not end soon. And what were the mistakes which have happened in the assessments of this war, and what should be done to improve this situation or at least understanding of it, and what has happened in these years?
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Well, I would like to start to come up with the bottom line up front. There's one thing I really would like to stress because it's very often overlooked. And that's the point that we have a really, really serious situation. We really have to understand that this year might bring us to a culmination point, and this culmination point will be decisive when it comes to the fate of Ukraine as we know this country. And I mean the country which was existing before the 90s, more or less. So let me start a little bit with a small analysis of the situation, what's going on the front lines, and what kind of things happened in the past, and why it is important to understand those things which happened in the past. So first of all, I think we can all agree that what the Russians did in the beginning was an absolutely failure. So this is, I think, something which has already written history. Whatever will happen, you can be sure hundreds of books will be written about this conflict, and you can be sure that the opening phase will be a clear point for Ukraine. Why was this possible? Because Ukraine has prepared itself very, very in a proper way, because they knew that the Russians will come again. They said this after 2014. Most of the Western world ignored it, more or less, but they knew that the Russians would come, and this gave them the possibility actually to repel the Russian attack in the beginning. But, and now comes the but, the Russians were in a shock state in the first weeks of the war because they were not expecting what was happening to them. But what they did is they adapted. And what they did is they actually forced the Ukrainians to fight a war of attrition. This is very, very important because a war of attrition is not so much about tactics. It's about resources, and that's the point. So over the months, we have seen that the Russians were able more and more to adapt themselves to the way they fought this war. And it's not only about the tactics of their forces, it's also about the resources and how to get these resources. So I would say Russia on its own would not be able to fight or even win that war, but it's not Russia on its own, it's Russia and the global south. And this is very, very important because the global south is like the red eyes in the dark who are looking what's going on here and helping the Russians, especially when it comes to China. Also India, we have to say this very blunt, this is one of the cases where the Russians are still able to bring up these resources to the front lines. The second point is what I have already mentioned, it's adaptation. So we see on the tactical, operational, and also on the strategic level that the Russians are able to adapt. Why is this possible? Because the Ukrainians get the proper equipment, but always in a very limited scale. So that means the Russians have the chance to adapt themselves on the threats they are facing. And this is very important. Because there is one very important principle in the military, it's the principle of saturation. That means you have to really have a massive effect on the enemy to force the enemy actually to surrender or even withdraw from the occupied territory. And this is not possible because all this equipment is always coming in piecemeal, more or less. So there is very sophisticated weapons. It's the HIMARS, it's the ATACMS, the gGmbH, all these kinds of different weapons. but the number is too slow, is too low. They're coming in too slow, more or less, because there is a political discussion behind it. And when they then arrive, the Russians will have a short effect, but they can adapt to this. And this is also important. And the Russians are learning and produce their own weapon systems by using their own military industrial complex, which is not really affected, not even by the Ukrainian UAV attacks. They have an effect, which you can also measure, but not a massive saturating effect. And this is the problem. And of course, from the tactical and operation level, we also have to think about the strategic level. And here I would like to point out once again the problem that we very often fall victim to our own propaganda. And as you know, we always have heard that the Russian Air Force doesn't fly properly, so there is no really possibility for them to fight, especially within Ukraine. And this is wrong, because there is already another repeated strategic air campaign against Ukraine. The Russians don't have to fly with their strategic bombers into the airspace of Ukraine. In addition, on the operational level, they have adapted in a way that they have their so-called gliding bombs, which they use on a very high scale. And the Ukrainians are facing a really catastrophic dilemma because they have only limited air defense. And the question is, do we have to use the air defense around our cities to protect the military industrial complex we have, or do we have to have the chance to give them to the front where they are needed? Because all these gliding bombs are pretty much have a devastating effect on the positions of the Ukrainians. Yeah? And you can see that the strategic level, which is the decisive level, because it decides if you're able to fight the long war or not, is more and more affected in a way that the Russians, because of their adaptation, are able to force this war of attrition in a negative way on the Ukrainians. And these are the three main things I would like to actually to stress, that we really have to understand that we have to go, in my opinion, either all in, so to give the Ukrainians what they need, or we have to say very blunt, okay, we are not willing to do so, but then we have to tell this to Ukrainians, because what we see at the moment is what I call a limbo. And the limbo means that there is no real winner, no real loser, and there are more and more thousands of deaths and wounded. And this is not very, I would say, promising in a way.
Wow, that are a lot of aspects you have mentioned. It is the war of attrition, which the Russians have entered in. That is the support for Russia from all types of regimes where you don't expect, or you didn't expect 3 years ago, that the Russians will depend or would depend on them, like North Korea or Iran. That is also the dilemma between the political willness or unwillingness to support Ukraine to extent of a decisive victory versus the military possibility to do it. So there is a chance to win, but there is no political will, obviously, to do it. And other aspects which are decisive for this war. And so before we go deeper into this discussion, please like, share, subscribe to this channel so you will never miss interviews like this. Dr. Gressel is an author of his Battlefield Breakdown bi-weekly report on our YouTube channel, and he addressed like several topics of which Dr. Reisner has already mentioned here. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. Gressel, about what is the biggest problem now. Like we have seen, you have published recently also on the European Resilience Initiative Center the study of the Russian military campaign, missile campaign against Ukraine, and how to deal with that. And several days ago, we had this mass Shahid attack on Ukraine, which caused a lot of trouble. And how do you assess this situation? Is it all about the political unwellness to do it? And how dependent is Russia on supplies from their North Korean and Iranian partners?
Well, on the drone campaign, of course, they depend on, or they depended a lot on Iranian support, not only by delivering drones, but also by assisting in the smuggling of subcomponents and technological items they needed for their own production. But now most of the drone war is supported by China, and most of the smuggling of critical components for the missile war is imported through China. Now, the issue of the missile war is like the ground war, it's a war of attrition, and Russia has increased its production of certain kinds of missile systems, especially the Kh-101 air-breathing cruise missiles, And this increased production, of course, gives them the possibility to fire at Ukraine at higher numbers than previously, and probably at higher number than the West is willing and able to supply ground-based interceptors. The next problem is, of course, that the West has not provided the significant numbers of ground-based air defense systems. You can protect both the city's critical defense industrial sites and, of course, logistical nodes, airports, etc. So Ukraine has a constant problem of having too many objects one would need to protect from Russian missile attacks compared to a few interceptors. Then we have an ammunition problem as well. Russia throws roughly 1,200 qualified air threats at the Ukrainian air defense system. So by that I mean air-breathing cruise missiles, ballistic missile, quasi-ballistic missiles like Iskander, aeroballistic missiles like Kinshal, whereas other air-breathing cruise missiles, Kalibr, etc. These are threats that need to be intercepted by a qualified air defense system, not by makeshift cannons or machine gun belts that can, of course, intercept drones, but cannot intercept these kinds of threats. And that, of course, is a high number. If you go through the production numbers of Patriot missiles, they have been published. We are roughly at 850 Patriots produced per year, but then, of course, not 850 Patriots per year will go into Ukraine, because you have Saudi Arabia firing them in the Red Sea theater. You have customers in Asia who are concerned about China, North Korea, that purchase, etc. Then, of course, you have SMPT, which had a very low missile production numbers. The French try to increase it, but nobody really knows whether the figures floating around in the press are actually real. And then you have IRIS-T and NASAMS to supplement that. If you add up the production numbers, then, well, if everything would go to Ukraine, you kind of barely would make it. But the problem is, as I said before, there are other customers as well. And that leaves us with fighters. So we have a lot of the blunt number of these incoming missiles, roughly 70%, are, of course, subsonic air-breathing cruise missiles that could be intercepted by fighter patrols. But then again, we're talking about numbers of aircraft, airworthy frames. Ukraine has lost quite a significant number of fighters during the war. The air war, I think, is the part of this war that hasn't been covered properly by the press and international media. There's much more going on than people suggest and think. And of course, the issue of ammunition. On July 8th, this dramatic attack on the children's hospital. Well, in the background of the children's hospital, there's you could see the smoke of the Artem factory in Kiev, and Artem produces the R-27 missile for Ukrainian fighter jets, which is the predominant missile by now that Ukraine uses to engage air threats. So, well, that is gone as well. And these are the problems: how to sustain the air defense system in Ukraine if your resources are really on knife's edge. And unfortunately, in the West, we knew that air defense would be the first thing where de facto obsolescence. So no, you still have launches, but you don't have ammunition. With the core, unfortunately, sort of the discussion about further donations for air defense systems started after Russia had destroyed much of the energy production capability in Ukraine, not before. Everybody knew, even since the Discord leaked that in the public, even in the public, people knew that ammunition stockpiles would be short, but nobody did anything. And that is bad planning, to just say it bluntly.
What I wanted to ask you here, before we go to other questions, we have observed all the time this discussion of how many cruise missiles and drones can Russia produce, and at the same time, how many Patriot systems and NASAM and RST systems we in the West can provide Ukraine with, including how many of interceptor missiles for these systems can we send. And what we hear all the time, that the West just cannot give Ukraine more systems, or that the interceptor missiles for the Patriot systems cannot be produced in a faster pace. And does it mean that Russia outnumbers the West in production of the means of destruction, like the cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, so we cannot fit with the interceptor capacities? Or is it just because Russia gives all in into this war and we don't go all in into protection of Ukraine? Because it sounds like counterintuitive that Russia can produce that much aerial targets that the whole collective West cannot find.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. But as you know, there are different means actually how you can project power. So you can use diplomatic means, you can use economical means, you can use military means, and of course, everything is based on a good situational awareness. Now it's a problem because the West decided more or less to follow the economical approach. So the idea was the sanctions will have a devastating effect on the Russians, and this is why the military objectives, the military strategy was never thoroughly defined, especially in the beginning, because we always said, well, the sanction will do, we don't have to raise production and things like that. Now comes the point. The Russians have understood this, and they are taking it really, really serious. You can laugh about North Korea, for example, but North Korea is bringing them a lot of ammunition, and they have their own ammunition production. General Cavaioli just recently said 3 million shells a year, plus the North Korean ones. So how many shells do we produce in the West? Because we still think, no, it's not necessary because the sanction will do. And the problem is we have to transfer to war production. Of course, the Western free world would be able to produce the means which are needed, but there is still no mean, because that means to have to come up with, you have to look at your budgets. You have to say, okay, we have maybe to split a little bit this and this section of the budget. We have to come up and produce in several shifts and so on and so on. It's said, the last RUSI report said it's 3.5 million people are working in the defense industry in Russia. 3.5 million. Ask yourself how many people are working in the West in the defense industry, especially in the big players. Even the United States, even they struggle to come up with the production. And of course, they have to make sure that different, let's say, crisis regions are more or less managed in a way that everyone is getting what they need. Think of the Israelis and so on and so on. So we still, this is what I stressed from the beginning, you should never underestimate the enemy.
For Western defense industry, you need to have budgetary clarity. If you take big ticket producers, they of course produce they assemble the entire weapon systems, but the production, all the subcomponents, is dispersed amongst a lot of subcontractors that are small and medium-sized enterprises. And if they employ new employees, and these are all qualified engineers, very high-priced people, specialists, and then start production, they need to know whether that will pay off. They can't employ people just for a few months or years. They basically need multi-year contracts to really make good on the investment. And if you see the budgetary discussions in the US, in Germany, where now basically aid to Ukraine has been slashed half, and I know a couple of defense industries that basically have their contract nullified because of that. In the UK, where finances are stiff, in France, where you don't have a government, none of the big ticket defense industrial players has the long-term contracts and the long-term security to really deeply increase production as they could in theory, because they don't know whether next year contracts will still go on, whether they will not go on, how long they can plan to have a full-scale production. There is no guarantee in that, for example, if the war would end earlier, that excess production would be bought by member states. So you, from the point of view of a private enterprise, you can't invest. And if you can't invest, you can't scale up production. In Russia, of course, things are clear. There's money for this. It comes from the oil and gas sector and will be poured into that. And regardless what it takes, there's no cost that will be spared to increase production. That's basically the difference. It's not that the West couldn't if it wanted. It doesn't want to.
That is an amazing point, which I would love to address once again. We have the problem, obviously, as far as I understand you, of this discrepancy between, or this gap between the political approach and military technological approach. We know what is needed to be done to achieve the victory for Ukraine or for the West, you name it. but we go into other ways because of the other concerns of political character. It could be budgetary concerns, it could be concerns of the consequences of such a victory on the field of international relations. It can be other reasons. And Dr. Reisner, does it mean that for many countries in the West, or for NATO, or for individual actors, this war is not seen as something which is vital for them? So they can say, okay, we will try to encapsulate it. We will try to separate us from this war, because if we go more deeper into this war, it will come to us, but we don't want this outcome. So we will just keep distance between us and this war.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm telling you that as an Austrian, as you know, our country morally is on the side of Ukraine, but militarily we are neutral. That's what we say, actually, in fact. But the point is, we have to understand that this war also can affect us. And just one sentence to what Gustav said. Yeah? History is full of examples how to fight wars and how it goes wrong or how it goes well. Yeah? So we just have to look at history. And I'll give you one example. I don't know if you ever have heard about the ammunition crisis of 1915. Huh? So the situation was on the West Front that Great Britain was not able to produce the ammunition which was needed on the front, because the private industries in Great Britain were not willing to produce these amounts of ammunition which are needed on the front. So at that time, the government had to make the decision to change those private companies to state companies. And from that moment on, producing in several shifts, not caring about the costs, not caring about the manpower, they were able to produce the shells that were needed on the front. This is the point. And I know this is something which doesn't fit in our heads, but it's a problem we have to actually consider more or less. Yeah? And if we don't do it now, we will have to fight another war in a couple of years, maybe. Maybe this, what we see here, is something like the small wars we have seen before the First World War on the Balkans, more or less, or even before the Second World War. Yeah? What we see here is history in the making, and a lot of people don't understand this. Yeah? There is also no right and wrong decision. It's on us to make any decision. Yeah? But just to wait is not enough. This is the problem. And as you completely right pointed out, a lot of people say, well, something is happening in Ukraine. We will take care about this. Sanction will work over the time because it's like poison. It just takes time how it works and so on and so on. It will not affect us. Yeah? But this is a wrong thinking. And as we know, when we compare it with the Second World War, especially in the beginning of it, we know that the Führer, because of the success he had, actually started to with his strategic goals to improve them more and more, actually, because okay, we won Poland, the Austrians, okay, it's already us. Okay, let's go to France, 6 weeks. Okay, why not taking the Balkans and so on and so on?
Dr. Gressel, we have already touched this idea of like what is achievable on the battlefield, how it is achievable, and we know that the situation on the ground in Ukraine now is extremely dire. As we are talking now, there are Russian troops trying to advance in front of on the district of Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, and my personal friends from the 47th Brigade are fighting there. We are now raising money to help them to fill the gap in like certain types of humanitarian equipment which they are lacking there. And we know that the Russians throw everything they have into this gap and trying to achieve as much as possible on the field. On another hand, you can say that, okay, the Russians are fighting for towns with the population of like several thousand people. They present as a victory the capture of Avdiivka recently, or before Bakhmut. There are towns with the population of several thousands, like dozens of thousands of people. It is not decisive, even if they go further. What is the Russian goal there? And can the Russians sustain these losses? We have, on one hand, this wishful thinking that, okay, the Russians will stop one day because they are losing like 1,000 men a day. No army can go into this, but it seems that the Russians can do it, but still, like they win just like small towns. What is their goal?
Well, I have to come back to the beginning of it. Is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the city you conquer is not as important, just as much as not as important how many much progress you make per day, it's not even as important how good you look and your forces are, as long as you can degrade the other forces more than your forces are degraded. So yes, these cities are all strategically unimportant, and yes, the Russians buy each city with tremendous losses. But what is on their calculus is how much does this attrit the Ukrainians, how much forces they lose, how much specialists they lose, how much equipment they lose. And as Ukraine has a much harder job of replacing losses, that is unfortunately something where the Russians have a point. They see the indecisiveness of the West. They have seen how much for example, the shell hunger period in spring this year has caused Ukrainian losses, and these losses are pretty much irreplaceable, because you cannot replace an armored vehicle, but to replace, for example, trained officers with long wartime experience, that is very hard. That takes years. It is much easier to produce a new armored vehicle than to produce qualified cadres. The same goes for soldiers. And the hope, of course, on the Russian side is to attrit the Ukrainian forces to the point that organized resistance collapses. From their point of view, it doesn't matter how much they have to improvise, how much motorcyclists they need to use, because they start to lack the armored personnel carrier to transport infantry to the front line. As long as the degradation effect on the Ukrainian side is still worse. And that is something we should really pay attention to, because we sometimes get carried away by the obvious signs of exhaustion on the Russian side and do not look at the obvious signs of exhaustion on the Ukrainian side, and the tactical mistakes that happen, the bad transition, sort of rotating in one brigade, rotating out the other brigade. These are all signs of exhausted troops. These brigades have been in the fight, especially in the most active sectors, for far too long. They're short on infantry. They are short of equipment in many places, and that leads to more gains on the Russian side. And if that sort of continues this way, then I fear that the Russian planning will be right. And here, we think that the war will be wedged to our political calendars when we have elections, and we want to postpone decisions after these elections and after that budgetary cycle, because we have to find compromises. That's all, of course, all true, but the war itself doesn't care for our election cycles and our budgetary debates and our Schuldenbremse, etc. The war carries on to the pace that the Russians can recruit new men and produce or refit and refurbish the next round of equipment.
What are the goals for this year for Russia and for Ukraine, Dr. Reisner?
As we have discussed already, again, I would like to emphasize one time more, this is a war of attrition. So it's about attrition. This is the most important thing we have to understand here. And we sometimes have the feeling everything quiet on the Eastern Front, but this is not the case, actually. Yeah? It's a war of attrition, a war of wills, more or less. Yeah? So what we see is also that the Russians try to exploit situations. So we have already heard that there was this shell hunger of the Ukrainians because there was a delay in the deliveries from the United States. And this dull, more or less, in the situation gave the Russians the possibility to consolidate and to prepare their summer offensive, which started with the attack on Kharkiv. And the principle on the operational level behind this was hyperextension. So it was, from my opinion, it was a bait, actually, because the Ukrainians with the best units, Azov and so on, they were sent actually to Kharkiv to stop more or less the Russian troops. But this was the troops which were invading there. These were not tier 1 or tier 2 troops. They were more or less tier 3 or tier 4. But the thing is, they were fixing the Ukrainians. And what we see then, and of course this is not happening from one day to another, it takes time that the Russians, by using actually more or less what I call the tactic of the 1,000 cuts, to fight against the Ukrainians, especially in Donbass, with the operational goal to occupy especially the oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk till the end of the year, actually. And more or less having something which they can sell to the people. Because as you know, the center of gravity for the Russians is the cohesion of the Russian society. So you have to feed the beast more or less in a way to give them an idea of what's going on the front and why we are winning, actually. I'm always saying, when you look in the Russian Telegram channels, for example, in the Russian social media, my impression is that after the failed Ukrainian offensive of last summer, the mood changed completely. They are thinking they're on the Silo heights and have a look to Berlin, actually. It's just a little bit. We don't care about the losses. It's just a little bit, comrades. We just have to fight and go on. And this is a problem, because I just referring to General Sirski, just recently in an interview with The Guardian, very clearly pointed out that at the moment it is said that the Ukrainians face about 520,000 Russian troops. At the end of the year, it will be up to 690,000, so nearly 700,000. So it's estimated from the Ukrainian side that every 3 months, the Russians can bring another 150 to 170,000 soldiers to the front. And this is the problem of a war of attrition. It took the Russians some time to gain momentum again, but now they have the momentum, and we have to say that clear. And they try to maintain this momentum and exploit it. And this is why we have to understand that the Ukrainians have to break that momentum to gain at least the initiative back, because at the moment, the Russians actually tell the Ukrainians where they have to react, and it's not vice versa. What should be the aim for the Ukrainians?
For Ukraine in this situation, they of course try to weather the storm as much as they can. The problem is there is no clear perspective from the West for what they will train Ukraine in the following year, with what equipment, with what amount of training, with what amount of ammunition. For Ukraine to recover the initiative, they need to plan their recreation of forces. They need to come up with operational plans that take into account the balance of firepower, the balance of equipment. And you can hardly do that if you have maybe 2 or 3 month advance notice of what will come to your side of the table of organization and whatnot. And here, the West really, after the US presidential election, need to make a decision on their strategy in the war. Where the war should end and what does it take. We are now still in the West in a kind of Afghanistan model, if I may say so, where we have very lofty political goals that do not match with the military reality on the ground, where we short feed and micromanage the war on the ground, and basically hope that at some point in some time something will happen that will automatically align sort of history with our aims. It didn't work out that well in the past, and it does especially not work in a high-intensity war like this one.
I just would stress once again what Gustav said. It's a high-intensity war. It's not a fight against the Taliban, or it's not a fight against the anti-Iraqi forces. It's not even a fight against the Houthis, actually. This is a tier 1 opponent. With a lot of means, we have no understanding. This is why I think we have to bring the military more when it comes to the assessments, and not only the political scientists. Sorry, Gustav, sorry, Dr. Gressel, to say that. Because there are a lot of things in the different domains which we have to understand. The electromagnetic field, for example, Western weapons don't hit their targets anymore because the Russians have adapted. So we have to adapt also, but this takes time. It takes time which you have to invest in research and which you have to invest in money, actually. And the Russians know this because they see it's now our momentum. HIMARS, GMLS is not hitting their targets. Excalibur is not hitting their targets. JDM-ER is not hitting their targets. Scalp, Storm Shadow is not hitting that. So we have to go to the front now because this is the chance we have, actually. And this is how wars are fought. History books are full of it. We just have to read it, actually. It's not that we are, let's say, facing something new. The basic rules are still the same.
The Ukrainians try to hit the Russian target, soft target, but high-value target like refineries or airfields far away from the front line, using drones, like mostly long-range drones, which more or less the propeller aircrafts are always a warhead attached. How much of effect can bring these attacks? They look to be very spectacular, and we know that, for example, the production of gasoline in Russia or diesel dropped. But do they bring enough effect, as they're not cruise missiles, they don't have enough of explosion on them, they don't have enough speed. They sometimes look like a desperation strikes, which look good, but do not bring decisive effect.
Well, also, I would say I'm very blunt here. So first of all, these strikes are important. They are very important, especially in the information domain, because Those strikes, and by the way, also what is happening in the Black Sea, show that at least in some domains, the Ukrainians also can gain momentum. This is important. But again, these strikes are just a starting point. There is still no this saturating effect, actually. You have to have a saturating effect. You have to come up with a critical mass of strikes to really have something which you can measure, pretty much. The strategic aim of the Ukrainians is to also attrit the Russian production of, let's say, oil, diesel, and so on, to make sure that they don't get so much money, actually, what they're getting at the moment from the Indians or from the Chinese, and so on and so on. So the thing is, I would even compare it a little bit with the end of the Second World War, what the German Reich did when sending V1 and V2 rockets, the Vergeltungswaffen, to Great Britain. They had a spectacular effect, but it hasn't changed the war. This is the point.
It depends on the scale. In the Black Sea, I mean, a lot of the reported attacks on Russian ships are those who are successful. Now, there are a lot more that are not successful, and that's the individual fate of a drone is to be shot down. And then that applies to pretty much every drone. But the issue, or sort of the advantage of drones, is you can easily scale up drone warfare. It's, for example, let's take naval drones. They're actually munition. I would rather compare them to a torpedo than to a warship. But producing a torpedo it requires the import of specialized parts who are heavily export controlled, is very expensive. To test and field a torpedo takes a lot of time, and you need a specialized launch platform. For naval drones, you can harness civilian yacht building or shipbuilding industry, everybody who can build a motor yacht for recreational purposes can, with a little bit of effort, build a naval drone. So you can scale the effort. And if you can scale it, of course, at a certain point, you overcome defenses, and some of these drones hit, and they have an effect. On the air drone war against Russia, we are not yet in the phase where the scale of the attack has an operative or strategic effect, like it did at least have an operative effect in the Black Sea. And that is a scaling problem. How much drones Ukraine can produce per month to throw at Russian targets, how much the Russian can intercept them, can defend them. Here, of course, Russians have a huge problem because their country is simply too large to have ground-based air defense everywhere, and it's even so large that fighter patrols have their problem catching Ukrainian drones. So they're coming through and they're hitting, but the thing is, of course, not the numbers that are put out now are, of course, too low to disrupt a Russian wartime production and the war economy on a sustainable and significant place. They here and there disrupt. There is an effect, but it doesn't show yet an effect on the war effort as such.
Indeed, what you have mentioned just now is that this number of Ukrainian drones which actually hit the Russian factories. If you look at numbers, how many of drones Ukraine has launched against Russia versus how many of drones Russia launched against Ukraine, you can see, of course, like we don't have the full numbers, but it looks like that the Ukrainian drones are much more efficient, and as soon as they just fly over the front line, they seem to be practically unstopped. Very few of them get intercepted over the Russian territory, in contrary to the Russian drones, which get intercepted over Kiev or over other cities massively. Some of them reach the targets, but most of them get intercepted. It seems not to be the case with the Ukrainian drones. As soon as they reach like Tatarstan with oil factories, or Volga area with oil factories, they get it and they fly into the targets. We have seen a lot of these videos. Dr. Reisner, my next question would be, what are the Ukrainian objects for this year? It most probably will not be an attempt of the next offensive. Is it to try to accumulate forces for the next year? Is it to attempt to hit Russian production behind the front lines, as you have mentioned, to get some political effect? And what should the West do to help Ukraine in this situation?
So first of all, I think we should all know this because Ukrainian told us what their aim is actually for this year. So this year is the year of the defense, actually. So what they have to do is to hold the line as long as possible. And the next thing is what they try to do is to bring the war into Russia, actually, because the center of gravity for the Russians is the cohesion of the Russian society. They have to feel that there is a war going on. It's not just something which happens in Ukraine. No, it's a war which can affect you here in your country. And the third thing, which I think is important for the Ukrainians, they have to make sure that there is the assistance of the West. This is the decisive point, actually. And now we have to understand something very, very important. There is not only a war going on in Ukraine, there is already also something what we call hybrid war. Because the main effect the Russians want to achieve is not only on the battlefield, they want to achieve an effect in our brains, in our heads, actually, in a way we call cognitive warfare. Because the assistance to the Ukrainians is, of course, strong connected to the democratic process in our countries, actually. If the politicians who are, let's say, the product of a democratic process, let's say a vote, still are willing to assist the Ukrainians will get what they need, actually. But if the people have the understanding triggered by hybrid means from the Russian side, well, this war, I don't know, it affects me already. I don't have what I need, actually. I cannot go on holidays, things like that. The Ukrainians have to do what they have to do. They have to arrange themselves with the Ukrainians. Then we have a strategic effect, which is even worse than what is happening on the front lines, actually, where it's about holding more or less the terrain. So we have to understand that the decisive thing, which the Ukrainians have to consider what they try from the 3 points I have mentioned, is to make sure that the West is still shoulder by shoulder and assisting them.
How much of Russia's of depleting of Russia's resources do we observe? We see all these satellite images of Russia's storage bases in Siberia with MTLB, these armored vehicles, practically a tractor on tracks, which Russians used for all the purposes during this war for transport of infantry. They even installed automatic guns on it or some rocket launchers. And we see that these warehouses are mostly depleted in Siberia. The same happened with S-300 air defense systems. But it looks like Russia finds all the time ways to compensate these losses. We were hoping for complete depletion of Russian warehouses a year ago. It is not the case yet. Will it happen next year, or does Russia always find like some sources, China, North Korea, and others? What should be done here?
Well, I may start also here again. So it's most experts who are really into the topic actually agree on the fact that the Russians, for example, I'll give you one example, produce about 1,200 to 1,500 tanks a year. 80% of those tanks are refurbished, more or less, from the scrapyards. But actually, they can do it because you have to physically destroy these 1,500 tanks, plus the ones which are already on the front. And also here, I citate General Sergej was saying we have about 3,500 main battle tanks at the moment at the front, which you all have to fight, actually, which you face and which you have to fight. So, of course, it costs also a lot of effort for the Russians to maintain this level. But most of the experts agree that they can maintain this level for the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, and then very likely it will go rapidly downwards if they're not improve even in a better way their war industry, and maybe if there is not more assistance from China and so on and so on. But the thing is, the key question is, let us look on the other side. Okay, can the Ukrainians also fight 2 or 3 years? Where are the main battle tanks the Ukrainians are getting? Actually, I'll give you one example. So the Americans delivered 31 Abrams tanks. It said about 10 to 12 are maybe already destroyed or damaged. But 31 is nothing, actually. They need they need at least 310 to stabilize the front in a way. And they need 3,100 to go in the offensive again, which is the aim for the next year, actually. And I tell you one thing, those 3,100 tanks, they are here. They are available, but they're not in Ukraine, actually. And there's a lot of other examples. HIMARS system. 18 HIMARS system run havoc on the Russians. Up to now, the Ukrainians have about nearly 40, actually. But the Ukrainians said, we need about 150 to 300 because it has a devastating effect. But they haven't got them. And now it's too late because the Russians have adapted to the HIMARS system. So this is the problem, actually, we see here. Always piecemeal, political discussions, still thinking sanctions will work. And we're facing the facts on the battlefield, which we can see now, because the Russians are trying to break through the Donbas front at Ocheretny on the way to Pokrovsk.
Indeed, and as far as I can see, there is this political assessment of what is happening there. Once again, policy. Of course, we are a democracies, and civilian politicians who are being directly elected by the people. They decide what to do. It is absolutely the basics of our democracies, the civilian dominance over the military decisions. But we see this assessment, as you have mentioned, like 18 HIMARS have havocked the Russian front line. And the conclusion which many pull out of this, it's not dangerous for us at all. When the Russians dare to attack NATO, they will be just wiped out. Their army will be destroyed. If 18 HIMARS have done this, just imagine what like 300 of HIMARS will do to the Russians. So we may relax, and we just don't need to care about what is going on. But is it not a wrong assessment if we imagine what will happen, what kind of resources Russia would get if they go deeper into Ukrainian territory and if they establish their control over this territory, and how much of political momentum they will gain by what they believe is to having defeated the collective West, as they say?
Well, yeah, the problem is the West does a lot of misperception here, and let me just 1 minute come back to Markus' points here. Yes, we see a depletion of Russian depots, but the problem is we have often fallen for the trap of linear progression. I would say if this continues just like it is, then Russia will run out of XYZ. Now, of course, I think 2 days ago, the first photographs of North Korean armored vehicles were spotted on the front, or close to the front. The second thing is Russians might well change their tactics. They of course produce a lot of losses now because they try frontal mechanized assaults. They could, for example, scale down their offensive action. They could more invigorate the bombing war. They are actually at some point substituting artillery fire with glide bombs, where they lack the artillery barrels to keep the volume of fire up. They throw more glide bombs, so they can tactically adapt, substitute, etc. Depleting stocks is of course a good sign, but only if the West is equipping Ukraine to exploit the possibilities of depleting stocks and denies Russia the ability to adapt. And that's not quite what we're doing. For Ukraine to adopt themselves, they need also predictability on, for example, the support and the financing of their own tactical changes. They're experimenting a lot. The drone warfare gets a lot of credit in the press, but the whole electronic warfare domain is equally dynamic. This pretty much includes command and control, using command and control assets to synchronize, to better manage your resources, etc. And that is also pretty hard if you do not know what your budget and your support will be in the next year. And finally, the industrial side, going back to the tank issue, KMW's wartime, if we would switch to wartime production, Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann would, for example, be able to produce 200 Leopard 2 tanks a year. But in order to do so, they need at least 5-year continuous war production to kind of make that happen. So we're talking about at least 1,000 main battle tanks that either need to go to Ukraine or to European armies, and somebody has to pay for. And now Germany has ordered 120, so 18 to replace and 105 as a supplement. Then we have some European contracts between 50 and 70 tanks each, and we will probably see 250 Italian ones. And that's it. And we're now 3 years into the war. Switching to war economy would have lasted 2 years to gear up. So if the decision would have been made at the beginning that, look, this is a war that would define, and it is a war that defines European security in the decades to come, and it's ours and we go in, then these decisions, if they were already made, would have given basically Ukraine a more plannable horizon. And not saying that every operation that would have been planned, it would have worked out the way we wanted it, but the dynamics of the war still would be a different one. And last but not least, I mean, on Ukrainian side, in this war of attrition, their biggest problem is the loss of qualified personnel that can't replace. And the more we hunger these armed forces out, the harder it will be to recreate these forces in the future, because you can recreate them in a technical sense that you supply the armored vehicles that you have in storage. But if you do not have good infantry, because all the young guys are already dead, if you don't have the sufficient numbers of officers, NCOs, staff officers to lead the whole bunch, because because you have exhausted these resources already, then sort of a later on lapse back on the technical material side will also not win you the war. This has to go hand in hand, and we have to be in the West very careful about the issue that Ukrainians really can't afford high personal losses, which unfortunately they have endured during the whole this year, latter part of last year.
This is this dilemma of Ukraine having bonded by the presence of Russian troops in Belarus and partly in Transnistria, like Russia-controlled part of Moldova. The Ukrainians have, as far as we know, a lot of their troops in the rear ports of their country, which practically are guarding the borders with Belarus and with Moldova. And there was this idea to replace these troops with some sort of Western troops, just to give Ukraine free hand so they could use these brigades on the front line, maybe in supportive missions, and to compensate the lack of manpower as Ukraine is struggling against the problems which they have with conscription in the country. This also looks like only substitutions. How much of this manpower problem will affect the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian society in the next year, Dr. Reisner?
Well, this is one of the core questions we have to ask ourselves when we look into the future. Just one thing which I would like to add to Gustav said. Once again, when it comes to our own forces, we have to be also self-critical, more or less. Yeah, there was just recently in one of the leading newspapers in Great Britain an article which was saying that NATO is able to protect 5% of its territory with air defense systems. Okay? And you have to think that, and you have to make sure that you understand that the last nearly 3 years consumed a lot of things which we had in our arsenals in the war in Ukraine. Ask yourself, how many Iris-T batteries does the Deutsche Bundeswehr have at the moment? When will they come in? When will they produce? It's nice to have a headline which is saying we will produce another 100 tanks, but you have to ask in what year they will actually come to the forces, and will the forces be able to have all the logistics, all the resources, all the ammunition they have to have for maintaining the systems, actually. Yeah. So there are two things we have to consider. The first is to assist Ukraine, and the other is to increase our own forces to a level where we can say, okay, the advisory, and this is the important thing, it's not about war. No one talks about going to war with Russia in a way like in Ukraine, but it's about the way how serious takes Russia us. Because they are not silly. They know exactly what we have in our garages and arsenals, more or less. And they say, well, okay, fine for us. We just go on. Because we know that there are not many Leopard tanks in Germany. It's not like in the 1980s, more or less. And again, and now this comes to the point when it comes to the people, we are post-heroic societies. And that makes a big difference, because the Russians and even the Ukrainians, they are heroic societies. This is why they fight each other in close battle in the trenches, actually. Yeah? It's not the case with us. I think you know the polls in Europe when they were asking, are you willing to fight for your country with your weapon in your hand? And the numbers are very, very low, actually. Yeah? And also here, this is perfect for hybrid war. You can exploit this, actually. Yeah? But let us talk a little bit about the numbers, actually, when it comes to Ukraine. General Zaluzhny said very clearly, we need a mobilization. President Zelensky was against it. And as we know, this request from Zaluzhny plus the failed Ukrainian offensive very likely brought solution to the point that they had to withdraw. Charles Sirski had the task to look at the forces in the rear of the country, the ones you have mentioned actually, the ones stationed to the north, facing Belarusian troops and so on and so on. He did this. He brought some of those units to the front. There were even new units formed, like the brigades with the number of 150 to 159. But also now, General Zariski said very clear, we have to come up with a further mobilization. We are running out of troops, more or less. There are estimates of Western think tanks that about up to 70% of the experienced personnel the Ukrainians had from the beginning of the war is already lost, pretty much. And this makes it so complicated. That means there are not many experienced soldiers which can train the Ukrainians in the rear of the country. This is why a normal infantryman has a 5 weeks training period, and then he goes to the front. Will have, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a little bit in the rear of it, and then he's in the trench, actually. Yeah? So there is not much time to learn, pretty much. But you have to understand, the Ukrainians, it's like after an accident, they are in shock. They have to do whatever it's necessary to survive, actually. Yeah? You cannot tell them, okay, you have to train the soldiers in 3 months and so on. They just want to survive, actually. For them, they follow Machiavelli. Yeah? I think you know what I mean. Yeah? And this is so problematic when it comes to war fighting, because it's not, there is no break in between. Yeah? You're always in a boxing fight. Yeah?
This sounds exactly like a danger if Ukraine fails to whatever scale. Like, it can not be like a defeat of Ukraine. It can be just an enforced ceasefire. We have talked already about the elections in the United States and the outcome of these elections. And what will the new president of the US decide? And whoever it will be, he or she may come to a conclusion there is too much of the war in the world. We cannot support Ukraine and concentrate in the Pacific, on the Middle East, etc. We just need to freeze the situation. But for the Russians, there is no such thing as a ceasefire. There is only a pause, only a break before the next offensive. So the Russians would exploit it once again and pressure the Ukrainians, and of course with hybrid operations. And then when the war comes to us, we are a post-heroic society, as you have mentioned, and who will protect us when Ukraine will be on the stage? We can say, okay, Polish army is pretty strong, Baltic countries are pretty decisive in their fight, but will it be enough? So, Dr. Gressel, how dire is the situation for us in the perspective of, let me say, 10 years?
Well, as Markus has already alluded, there is a sort of the peace dividend is still ongoing, and we haven't brought our armed forces really to the state they should be. The second thing is, of course, the Russians, as much as we can belittle them for some of the crazy stuff they do, they have more experience and they have learned some stuff that works and that is at least lethal. So I feel when I talk to Western officers, I often hear this kind of tone that, well, Ukrainians, then after 3 years of war, they have lost their best personnel. They can't maneuver anymore because they didn't have the planning and leadership capabilities. But we would still have, and we would outmaneuver the Russians, and we can concentrate forces, and we can. We are much better at kind of having synchronizing large combined arms operations. So we will be a different piece of meat. Yeah, that's true for the first 2 weeks. The problem is, let's take Belousov's number of 4,000 strike drones Russia should produce per day. That would mean 120,000 strike drones. So from the Lancet down to volunteer-made FPV drones per month, 120,000. Well, even if it's short of that, if this would be unleashed at a standard European army that has no drone detectors, very few electronic warfare systems, has no soldier, no SWAT, no company or platoon level training on how to behave under drone threat, this alone, regardless the maneuvers on the ground, would attrit the vehicle and armored vehicle stockpile of any European army within a very short amount of time. And then you're bogged down to trenches because you don't have the vehicles and you don't have the stuff to maneuver around. Those are the problems in most European armies. They're professional armies. They have very few reserve officers, very few reserve NCOs. They have no infrastructure for mass training, and they have no vehicle depots. So the whole issue that if you are in the trenches after 2 weeks, how to actually sustain that, how to replenish your stocks, to replenish your personnel would become an urgent question. And here it's of course very hard to change the mentality in peacetime in Europe in our armed forces. But those generals who are engaged in the support of Ukraine and who see what's going on there, they ring the alarm bells in our ministries as well and say, look, guys, we are as much proud as we can be of what we have done in Afghanistan or in Iraq or here and there in Mali. This is a very different piece of cake, and our armed forces by no way are in a position to sustain that. And that is a problem because the Russians know as well.
And we do not have experience in dealing with the losses of our armies. Bundeswehr has lost over 50, I think 52 personnel in Afghanistan. And it was a big trauma for us, understandable. Each loss of each life is a tragedy. But when it comes to a war of the scale we're facing in Ukraine, these are losses an army can have within a day or several hours. Maybe one successful attack of Russian Iskander on a group of soldiers can bring these losses, like Ukrainians have experienced several times in the south of Ukraine. And we're not ready for that. And of course, the lack of equipment you have mentioned already, the lack of production on our side, and the time we need to scale up our production. Is there any way of that, Dr. Reisner? Or will it, like it has happened already several times in history, as you have mentioned before, that we will wake up only when we will have to, not preparing ourselves for the worst case scenarios in advance, but just trying to find a solution ad hoc?
Well, that is the key question. And as history has, when we look at history, actually, on what history tells us, that very often someone has to attack a country, and then the people in that country which is affected understand, okay, it's now getting serious, actually. This is the problem we have. So people like us, we were trying to tell the people, okay, listen, no one wants a war. No, I am a father of 3 kids. I have 2 sons. I would be crazy if if I go actually for an extended war, like a third world war, whatever it is. I just want to make sure that everyone understands we have to prepare. We have to make sure that the advisory understands that we are prepared so that he will not attack us. We have to be something like what is called a fleet in being, more or less, something like this. And this is not the case at the moment. This is not the case. The Ukrainians, the fight against the Russians, they bring us time to prepare, more or less. Time we have now to prepare, but we still don't do it, actually. If you have a discussion like the ones we have here, very often people say, well, you're a warmonger, but what are you still telling us? We don't want to go to war and so on. I'm not a warmonger. I don't want to go to war. I'm the member of the armed forces of a country which exclusively say we are just here to defend our country, not to do any aggression to other countries, whatever it is. So I'm really focused on the defense of my country, of the people who are living here, and so on and so on. And I want to tell the people, listen, first of all, war is not only what we have seen in the history books. There are different levels of war. So there's the hybrid war, actually, which is going on already. When you switch off the television, when you go on YouTube and you search for something, you may be a victim of a hybrid war, actually. You have to understand this. And on the other range, there is maybe something like a full-scale war, like we've seen in Ukraine, actually. And you have to understand we have to prepare now to avoid that this will happen to us. Because if the advisory is crossing our country's borders, it's maybe too late, and we will have a lot losses, actually. So what history tells us, very often in history, people are not really able to understand that these things are, let's say, confronting them. The problem of an historian is he gives you the impression that everything was clear from the beginning. That's not the case. When you look at the First World War or even the Second World War, no one was actually thinking in 1914, for example, that something like the devastating First World War will happen. At that time, it was called the Great War. After the Second World War, they called it the First World War, actually. No one in 1938 was thinking there will be another war. most of the people who were the decision makers at that time fought in the First World War on the front in Verdun or in Isonzo. Yeah? You must be crazy if they actually would have wished for another war. Yeah? It was just history in the making. Yeah? And what you can learn out of it is prepare yourself to avoid the same problems we have seen in the past, the same, how should I say it, the same losses. Actually, we see all the things. We were just talking about the killed ones. Just think about the wounded, yeah? The ones who have post-traumatic stress disorder, what this means for the society, not only in Ukraine, but also all over the world. So this is something which I really, as a historian, very sorry of, because I'm thinking now it's the 21st century. After hundreds of bloody fights, again, we are on the doorstep to hell.
Indeed, and that is maybe the biggest threat which we are facing now. Our societies are still not prepared to face the reality and to mobilize for the new war in order to avoid it, because the preparation for a war is also a way to avoid it and not to jump into it or get forced or dragged into it. If you're not prepared, you can just be seen by an aggressor as an easy target, and this increases the chances that you will get attacked. While when you are strong and decisive, you can choose what are your response. You can decide what kind of involvement in that conflict or another conflict you can have in order to end it as soon as possible and as effective as possible. And this was an interview with Dr. Gustav Gressel, who is a fellow at the European Resilience Initiative Center, ERIC, and a senior fellow at the European Center for Foreign Policy, ECFR. And it was Dr. Markus Reisner, Colonel of the Austrian Army and the head of the Institute of Officers Basic Training at the Austrian Military Academy. Thank you for this very deep and insightful interview, and for your perspective of the war, which is still ongoing and will be with us, unfortunately, for a pretty longer time. Thank you so much.